Southeast Asia is home to plenty of islands held by many different nations. Some are split in half, some are tropical paradises, some are too much of tropical paradises. Some shaped global history, some are sinking, some are thriving, and sitting nearly in the center of them is Borneo, which itself is split up by 3 different countries. Indonesia holds the largest part, split among their 5 divisions of Kalimantan. The northern shore is nearly all part of Malaysia, Sarawak and Sabah, and up here is teeny tiny Brunei, which has managed to preserve its monarchy for over 650 years. This makes Borneo not only the most divided island on Earth, ignoring Cyprus which is a bit more complicated, but it makes for a great case study to see how different histories can affect standards of living across a shared geography. If we look at per capita output across the countries, a clear trend emerges. The northern countries have higher standards of living, with Kalimantan being the lowest at about $6,500, East Malaysia somewhere in the middle with around $12,000, and the people of Brunei living with the most comfort, at least material comfort, at around $33,000, being one of the few absolute monarchies left on Earth. The Sultan of Brunei, Hassan al-Bolkiah, has ruled for its entire independent history since 1984, and in some ways, it's him and the past Bruneian sultans which are the main characters of the story, being the only nation on the island which has been able to preserve itself in some form from European colonization. They did this with 2 things, making massive concessions to the British and good old oil money. Let's start off with these riches. Brunei is small both physically and in terms of population, but because they produce a decent amount of oil and gas, their entire economy revolves around them. Over 90% of export and government revenue comes from fossil fuels, giving Bruneians the 2nd highest per capita income in Southeast Asia. But perhaps more importantly, since per capita income doesn't really matter for oil exporters, a much more comfortable life than their Asian and Bornean counterparts. Brunei has been described as the closest thing on Earth to a complete welfare state, or as they like to call, a shellfare state. There's no income or corporate tax, free education and healthcare for citizens, subsidized fuel, food and housing, cheap loans, and a comfortable job for men in the government, where over a quarter of people work.
You want a job? Come to me. Wallahi, I'll get you a job. You want money? I'll raise the money for you. No problem. I'll get you into uni.
Which probably gives the capital, Bandar Seri Begawan, the vibe of a nursing home. For all this free stuff comes the social contract though, with the Sultan leaning towards the authoritarian side. There's the usual restrictions on free speech you see in dictatorships, as well as a ban on organized civil society. But as the king grows older, more conservative, and more religious, aspects of Islamic Sharia have been codified into law. Things like stoning as punishment for adultery, a ban on Christmas, and cutting thieves' hands off. Though these are enforced to varying degrees. The royal family doesn't seem to have a moral problem with flying planes full of prostitutes. It's oil which makes the family one of the richest and most spendthrift on Earth. The king's net worth has fallen dramatically since the 80s, as he's just spent an unholy amount on an almost 2,000 room palace, luxury hotels, and a collection of thousands of cars, including his famous gold Rolls Royce. And it's oil which has even kept the country independent in the first place. But before we go on, let me tell you one reason why oil is so important. Defense. Can't run tanks and planes without oil. One of the best ways to really understand this is through War Thunder. It's the biggest vehicle combat game ever created, and it's free on PC, consoles, and mobile devices too. Join over 95 million players as you battle in thousands of different tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships of 10 different nations from over 100 years of combat. This is one of the most detailed games I've ever seen, with great graphics, realistic sound effects, and vehicles modeled down to the individual components. If you're into military history, this game is simply a must-try. Use my links in the description and pinned comment to get a massive bonus pack for new players and returning players who haven't played the PC or console version for at least 6 months. With it, you can get multiple premium vehicles and an exclusive vehicle decorator, but it's only available for a limited time. So thank you to War Thunder, and let's get back to Borneo. At the height of Bruneian power, it used to control the entire island of Borneo. When the Christian Portuguese captured Malacca, Brunei served as an alternate trading hub for Muslim merchants, monopolizing it and creating a thalassocracy, a form of government based on boat power. But when the Spanish captured Manila, the government's ability to control the waters started to wane, eventually losing control of the north to the Sulu after a decade-long civil war. Pirates often raided the north shores, and on top of that, Europeans were now trying to establish forts and factories all over the archipelago to secure their own monopolies. Europeans like this guy. He's James Brooke, and just a humble guy, really. He was born and raised in India and wanted to establish a trade route with Brunei. Apparently, when he sailed over with his crew, the southern half Sarawak was in the midst of a rebellion. He helped to put it down to trade, and the Sultan was so thankful that he allowed James to be a vassal of his. At least for the small price of $2,500 a year. James Brooke was made Raja of this territory in 1842, the White Raja of Sarawak, first of his title. The White Raja would go on to continue this bizarre state for 2 more generations of Brookes. James Brooke, its founder, had expanded its territory from this to this through a series of deals, taking advantage of disputes between local rulers. The country had no treasury and used a system where titles to rule could be bought from the Sultan, making it hard to lead an organized effort against the Brooke family. Now, his little kingdom wasn't explicitly set up by the British government, it was just a guy who somehow ended up as local leader of this land. But the British saw the value in controlling the sea lanes over here, giving him naval support, essentially making Sarawak a British territory. James's son Charles was much more of the businessman, trying to promote a sago export industry using foreign money and Chinese immigration, though they didn't permit any European business to be set up, choosing to protect the Brooke monopoly over fast exploitative growth. The Sultan was wary of the Brooks' growing influence though, so to counteract it he, bear with me, sold a chunk of northern Brunei to an American businessman. I guess to balance different types of foreign rulers on both halves of the island. However, that land turned out to be pretty unprofitable and would eventually be resold to the British North Borneo Company, and again expanded through deals with local rulers. The company was much less focused on administrating its people and building institutions to legitimize royal rule like the Brookes had. It was run almost entirely for the extraction of jungle-based products, being like a loose trade organization between British merchants and indigenous people. The Sultan was right that there would be competition between the two, but that competition ended up being who could swallow Brunei's land the quickest. By the 1880s, Brunei, now a rump state, couldn't afford to keep itself independent any longer, and the Sultan chose to become a British protectorate, in exchange for a promise to freeze British land grabs, which the Brookes broke 2 years later, splitting what remained of the kingdom in half with the annexation of this territory. The plan was to leave the Sultanate alone until the current Sultan died, then dismantle the monarchy and integrate it into Sarawak. But God answers. Black gold saved the kingdom. At the same time the British were getting really concerned they didn't have a domestic oil supply, it was found in the tiny remaining sultanate that they had just made theirs. 3 years after oil was found, the British then placed a resident there, while keeping the Sultan in power to pretend like he was making decisions, making them a part of the British Empire, not Sarawak. So the British ended up with 3 colonies on Borneo: Brunei, Sarawak, and North Borneo, later called Sabah. These ones were under the control of a private company and a British guy who'd been the 3rd king of this territory. The British then had no colonies when the Japanese invaded the island. After World War II, the Brookes were financially devastated, and both these territories were transferred to direct British rules as crown colonies. Alongside the invasion came a wave of nationalism which spread across the Dutch East Indies and Southeast Asia in general. Indonesia gained its independence after a war with the Dutch, while the British colonies opted for the peaceful route. In amalgamation of British colonies, Malaya had gotten it in 1957. It was only natural to extend the offer to the rest of the British Malay states. The nationalist Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman invited the three colonies to join them in a union, which leaders of Sarawak and Sabah took him up on. In 1963, they formed the Federation of Malaysia, signing the Malaysia Agreement, MA63, to ensure the Bornean states would be treated as equal members, attaining some degree of autonomy over their revenues and resources. Over time, some of these guarantees would erode as the Malaysian state centralized. Most importantly, those of their oil revenues, which the provinces only get to keep 5% of, while the rest goes to the national company Petronas as a form of national development. Some resentment has boiled up as many Borneans feel they missed out on the economic miracle Malaysia has gone through in the last few decades, with their economies still much more tied to the mines and the jungles, which peninsula-based companies and federal agencies manage. For longer than Sabah has, Sarawaks pushed back against the Malaysian government and maintained a unified political culture, with pro-Sarawak parties constantly winning local elections. Recently, they've established their own state oil company in 2017, and as of 2019 are enforcing a 5% tax on petroleum products. The levels of development reflect the respective regions' resistance to foreign entities. Sarawak today is one of Malaysia's richest provinces, while Sabah is one of its poorest. As for Brunei, just a year before the Union of Malaysia, a rebellion by the only pro-democracy and left-wing party in its history had spooked the Sultan into declaring a state of emergency, which has technically lasted for its entire history since. On top of that, Malaysia wanted a significant chunk of Brunei's oil revenues to develop the country nationally, which the Sultan, getting used to this lavish life, protested against. Despite persistence by the British for Brunei to join, and these rebels wanting to join Malaysia, the Sultan personally refused, opting to stay a British protectorate. In fact, when the British government thought about pulling away from Brunei, the Sultan threatened to take his massive fortune out of British banks and quit. The second part, he actually did, abdicating in 1967 in favor of his son, the current Sultan. Still marked by fears of the rebellion as well as Indonesia's invasion of East Timor, Brunei pleaded with Britain to keep a Gurkha regiment stationed in the country, which they reluctantly agreed to. The Gurkhas still defend the royal family to this day. That's so 1800s. Then there's the south. Even though it's the more complex part of the island, its history is arguably less complicated than the Malaysian side. The Dutch had been conquering the islands of the archipelago to make sure no other European country could touch their nutmeg profits. This included the central island of Borneo, but unlike the British system of attempting to keep local rulers in charge while they pulled the strings, the Dutch directly administered the islands. At least it was direct rule by the time they found that sweet, sweet oil. By then, to the Dutch, Borneo was little more than a shell pump. The place that fueled Marcus Samuel's oil empire, alongside his trusty brother, Samuel. So with the rise of nationalism after the war, they didn't rebel as the sultanates of Pontianak or Sambas or Banjarmasin as it was conquered as, but as part of the broader Dutch East Indies. It was clear that Kalimantan would be governed as a central part of the new United States, then later Republic of Indonesia. The theme throughout independent history was, the more centralized the Indonesian state was, the worse Kalimantan fared. This is because the majority of Indonesians as well as Indonesian business and military power was found on the island of Java. The reign of President Suharto was particularly centralizing, leading Indonesia's new order. He consolidated political parties and gave special economic rights to his family members and military-linked companies. These Java-based companies would of course benefit from Kalimantan's timber, coal, and oil resources, more than the Kalimantans themselves. After 32 years of rule, Suharto suddenly stepped down in the midst of financial crisis-fueled protests, ushering in a government dedicated to democratic principles which passed 2 laws to decentralize Indonesia. At least 25% of domestic revenues now go towards regional development, by law. But today, as a result of the Dutch and Indonesian legacies, Kalimantan still lags behind Malaysia and Brunei, where many people live a much more rural life than the north. It might get better. In 2019, President Jokowi announced plans to move the Indonesian capital away from Jakarta to East Kalimantan. Jakarta might be the center of Indonesia, but it's also literally sinking because too many people live on the marsh it was built on, with parts of the city destroyed every year by flooding. The new city of Nusantara is planned to be 3.5 times the size of Singapore and hopes to host 2 million people by 2045, when the government wants to complete it by. That would make it the largest city on the island by far. Kalimantan has 1/9 of the population as its metropole, Java. East Malaysia has around 1/4 of West Malaysia's population, and Brunei has 100% of its metropole. These relative sizes reflect the relative level of development on the island. The further north you go, the more autonomy the people have over natural resource revenue, and the richer and higher developed it is. Though if you go too north, local power weakens, stemming from the loose colonial governance Sabah was a part of. Brunei is an outlier, not just on Borneo, but on Earth. It's in an odd position where it's an almost depoliticized country whose entire economy is based on the Sultan giving away his oil wealth. It seems almost obvious that it could all come crashing down one day, as every article ever written about it will say. Or, with the trend of increasing autonomy over Borneo's natural resources, Brunei could be seen as an early adopter of the next phase of Bornean history. Just a reminder that you could use the links in the description and pinned comment to play War Thunder for free. And if you enjoyed this video, why not check out another? This one is about why we haven't been able to replicate Dubai's success despite trying so hard. Thank you, and subscribe.